He hadn't eaten in 2 days. The sound of his daughter's chewing, soft, careful, guilty, was the only thing keeping him awake that night. The half sandwich she held was all that was left in the house. He told her he wasn't hungry. He lied. When she finally fell asleep, he sat by the window, watching the empty street shimmer under the cold morning light. His stomach twisted, his pride tighter. Tomorrow, he thought, he'd find a way. He always did. But when he opened the door at dawn, a white sedan was parked across the street. A woman in a navy coat stepped out, holding a brown paper bag. "Mr. Harris?" she asked, her voice steady, almost rehearsed. He didn't know her, but she knew too much about him. The silence of the kitchen was a dense, physical weight. It was the silence of an unplugged refrigerator, a silence that had started 2 weeks ago when the last of the ground beef thawed and spoiled, and Daniel Harris couldn't afford the luxury of pretending the electricity bill wasn't sitting right there on the counter. He was a man of 38, but in the thin, pre-dawn gray, he felt ancient. The apartment, wedged into a row of identical paper-walled structures built for transitory lives, smelled of dust and the faint, sweet echo of the peanut butter from his daughter's sandwich. The only sandwich. He hadn't eaten in 48 hours. His hunger was a dull, hollow ache, but his pride was a sharper, more immediate pain, twisting tighter in his chest every time he heard Lily breathe. He sat at the small, laminate table, his chair scraping quietly against the cracked linoleum. He had watched his 7-year-old daughter, Lily, eat that half sandwich 4 hours ago. He had found the last 2 slices of bread, near stale, and the scraping of the bottom of the peanut butter jar. She had looked up at him, her eyes wide and knowing, and tried to break it, offering him the larger piece. "I'm not hungry, baby," he'd said, the lie tasting like ash. I ate earlier." She knew. Kids always knew. She ate it slowly, each bite careful, guilty. That sound, the soft chewing, was the only thing that had mattered in the world. Now, she was asleep in the next room, a small mound under a thin blanket, her breathing the only rhythm in the suffocating quiet. Daniel ran a hand over his face, the stubble rasping against his palm. He was a broad-shouldered man, built for the heavy lifting and precise welding he'd done at the plant for 12 years. Then the incident, a hydraulic press malfunction, a spray of superheated fluid. He'd pulled 2 men clear, but his own arm had been scalded, the nerves damaged. The settlement was tied up in litigation, the company arguing negligence on his part. Disability was a bureaucratic nightmare. The union rep stopped returning his calls. He was laid off, pending investigation. That was 3 months ago. 3 months of watching the small savings account evaporate. Then the checking. Then the change jar. Now, there was nothing. He looked at the objects on the counter, illuminated by the single, weak bulb above the sink. There was the eviction notice, which had been slid under his door yesterday. It was bright red, a color that felt violent in the muted apartment. Final notice to vacate, tenant in arrears. Beside it, another letter, this one from the power company. Paler, but just as final. This was the landscape of his failure. This was the indifferent society that saw him only as a delinquent account, a statistic. He felt the judgment of his neighbors through the walls. He heard them in the mornings. Mrs. Gable in 3B with her sizzling bacon, the mechanics in 2A laughing as they left for work. They saw him, the man who stayed home. They saw him walk Lily to the bus stop and then walk back, his head down. They didn't see the applications, the phone calls that went unanswered, the physical therapy appointments he'd skipped because the copay was $20. His gaze drifted to the corner of the room, by the door. Lily's school backpack was ready. Tucked into the side mesh pocket, its one remaining button eye seeming to watch him, was Barnaby. Barnaby was a brown teddy bear, worn bald in patches, its nose missing most of its stitching. Lily had carried Barnaby since she was 2, a gift from her mother before she left. The bear was her armor, her confidant. It was the one thing in her life that was constant, besides him. And sitting next to the backpack, gleaming under the weak light, was the plastic shell of her lunchbox. It was empty. He had opened it mechanically after she fell asleep, hoping, irrationally, that a juice box or a granola bar might have materialized. It remained stubbornly, brightly, terrifyingly empty. He thought of tomorrow, today. In a few hours, she would wake up. He would have to explain the lunchbox. He would have to smile, to invent another story, another fiction, to keep the cold reality at bay. His desperation was a physical thing, a cold pressure in his lungs. He had to do something. He couldn't let her see this. He couldn't let her see him like this. A father reduced to watching his child starve. The thought of the day labor line crossed his mind. Standing in the cold at 4 in the morning, begging for a chance to lift things with his good arm, maybe getting $20, maybe $30. It was a gamble, and it meant leaving Lily alone to get herself to the bus. He couldn't. He just couldn't. The gray light outside the window began to turn a pale, watery blue. Dawn. The streetlights outside clicked off, plunging the room into an even more desolate shadow. The city was waking up, but Daniel felt like he was being buried. He stood, his knees cracking in the cold, his stomach seized, a violent, cramping reminder of its emptiness. "I will find a way," he thought. The words a hollow promise he'd been making for weeks. "I always do." He moved to the door, his plan formless. Maybe he would go to the plasma center. Maybe he would pawn the watch his own father had left him, the last good thing he owned. He just had to be back before Lily woke up. He pulled on his thin jacket, the zipper snagging. He took a deep breath, steeling himself against the cold air and the shame. He turned the deadbolt, the sound unnervingly loud in the quiet apartment. He eased the door open, wincing at the creak of the hinges, praying it wouldn't wake Lily, and he stopped. The street outside was empty, save for one vehicle. Parked directly across from his apartment, engine off, was a clean, white sedan. It was unmarked, anonymous, and it didn't belong in this neighborhood of rusted pickups and battered hatchbacks. As he watched, the driver's side door opened. A woman stepped out. She was tall, dressed in a sharp navy blue coat that looked expensive, out of place. She held a brown paper bag in one hand, the kind from a bakery, and a briefcase in the other. She looked up, her gaze locking directly onto his apartment, onto him, as if she had been waiting for that exact hinge to creak. She crossed the street, her heels clicking decisively on the pavement. She stopped at the bottom of his short walkway. She didn't smile. Her voice was steady, perfectly modulated, almost rehearsed. "Mr. Harris?" Daniel's hand tightened on the doorknob. He didn't know this woman. He had never seen her before in his life. But she was here, at dawn, on his doorstep, holding a bag that smelled faintly of fresh bread. And she knew his name. Daniel's body went rigid. The cold morning air, which seconds ago had been his primary antagonist, was now just a backdrop to this new, surreal threat. His first instinct was to slam the door, to lock the deadbolt, to pretend this wasn't happening. But he was frozen, one hand on the doorknob, his thin jacket offering no protection against the woman's piercing, analytical gaze. She didn't approach any closer, maintaining a careful, almost clinical distance of 10 feet. The power imbalance was a physical chasm. His cracked concrete stoop versus her polished leather shoes. His frayed cuffs versus the perfect seam of her wool coat. The brown paper bag she held seemed ordinary, but in her hand, it felt like a prop. "My name is Clara Moore," she said. Her voice was exactly as he'd first heard it, steady, rehearsed, and devoid of pity. It was the voice of someone delivering information, not offering sympathy. "I'm a case liaison with the American Workshop Fund. We're a private nonprofit that provides support for families in the skilled trades who are facing transitional hardship." She used the word hardship as if it were a technical term from a manual, a sanitized descriptor for the raw panic he felt every second of the day. He said nothing, his throat tight. He was acutely aware of the red eviction notice visible through the gap in his door, lying on the kitchen counter. "May I offer you this?" she asked, gesturing with the paper bag. "It's just some breakfast items. Pastries, some fruit." She didn't wait for an answer, but walked calmly up the path and placed the bag on the top step, then retreated to her previous position. It was a calculated, non-threatening movement, like one might use to approach a stray animal. "We're aware of your situation, Mr. Harris. The layoff from the plant, the pending arbitration, the difficulties you've had with unemployment benefits." Her knowledge of him was staggering. It wasn't just his name. It was the architecture of his failure, spoken aloud on his own doorstep. He felt exposed, as if the walls of his apartment had dissolved. "Who told you that?" Daniel's voice was a low rasp. "Is this from the church? St. Jude's?" He hadn't been to a service in over a year, not since he'd had to pick up Sunday shifts to make ends meet. Sometimes the churches ran food banks, but they didn't make house calls in white sedans. "We're not affiliated with any religious organization," Clara replied smoothly. "Our funding is entirely private. We receive referrals from a wide net of community partners and public records. Sometimes neighbors." He glanced instinctively at Mrs. Gable's window. The blinds were shut tight. He couldn't imagine her doing this. Her charity was judgment, not pastries. Clara seemed to read his suspicion. She offered a small, thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Harris, I understand your hesitation. We're not from child services. We're not here to inspect your home or to question your capabilities as a father. In fact, it's because you've worked so hard to avoid the state system that you've been flagged for our program. We believe in helping people before they're forced to ask for it." This was the hook. It was designed to disarm him, to appeal to the very pride she was currently stripping from him. He found himself wondering, absurdly, if she was single. It was a fleeting, ridiculous thought. A man in his position. A woman with her composure. It was a defense mechanism, his mind creating a different, more understandable narrative. A lonely professional. A project. It made more sense than this cold, efficient benevolence. The smell of the food wafted from the bag. It was warm. He could smell yeast and cinnamon. Lily. Her empty lunchbox. The half sandwich last night. His own stomach, which had been a tight knot, now cramped with a painful, sudden hunger. His pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. His role as a father was the only one that mattered. "What do you want?" he asked, the words clipped. "We don't ask for anything," Clara said, her tone softening almost imperceptibly, as if this were the part of the script she enjoyed. "We're here to provide assistance, a hand up, not a handout. Inside this envelope is a cashier's check for $2,000. It should be enough to cover your back rent and the utility bills." She produced a white business envelope from her coat pocket and, like the bag, placed it on the step. $2,000. The number was so large, so impossible, it sounded like a joke. I can't pay that back," he stammered. "It's not a loan," she said. "It's an investment. In you. In your daughter." As she spoke, her eyes flickered for just a moment, up and over his shoulder, toward the corner of the street. Daniel's gaze followed hers instinctively. At the intersection, mounted high on a telephone pole, was a black, dome-shaped security camera. It was new. He didn't remember seeing it last week. It was aimed generally at the intersection, but it had a clear, unobstructed view of his front door. He'd assumed the city or the police had installed it after the string of break-ins last month. He looked back at Clara, who was now looking directly at him, her expression unreadable. "What's next?" he asked, his hand moving toward the bag. "Cash the check," she said, her voice back to its business-like cadence. "Get your power turned back on. We will be in touch, Mr. Harris. This is just the beginning of the assistance we can offer." The promise hung in the air, heavy with unspoken conditions. He hated this. He hated the feeling of being a specimen, a project. But the sight of the envelope, thick and white, next to the bag of warm food, broke the last of his resistance. He bent down, his bad arm aching in the cold, and picked up the bag and the envelope. The warmth of the food seeped through the paper into his cold fingers. "Thank you," he said, the words feeling like gravel in his mouth. "You're welcome, Mr. Harris." She gave a single professional nod. She turned, walked back to the white sedan, and got in. The engine started with a quiet, expensive hum. She didn't look back as she pulled away, disappearing around the corner. Daniel stood on the porch for a long time, the bag in one hand, the envelope in the other. He felt a profound sense of relief, followed immediately by an equally profound sense of dread. He looked down the street where the car had vanished, then up at the dark, impassive eye of the camera on the corner. It seemed to be watching him. He shook his head, trying to clear the paranoia. It was just a camera. This was just a miracle. He backed inside, locking the deadbolt, the smell of fresh bread finally, gratefully, filling the silent kitchen. The first thing Daniel did was turn the power back on. The 15-minute walk to the utility office, with the cashier's check heavy in his pocket, felt like a march. He expected to be interrogated, to be treated with the same bureaucratic dismissal he'd grown accustomed to, but the clerk barely looked up, processing the payment with bored efficiency. When he returned to the apartment, he stood in the kitchen and flipped the main breaker. The refrigerator, silent for 2 weeks, gave a shudder, and then began to hum. It was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. The single bulb above the sink, which had been dimming on the emergency power, now shone with a bright, steady light. That evening, he and Lily ate the pastries from the brown bag for dessert. He had cashed the check, paid the landlord the $700 in back rent, and used the remainder to buy groceries. Real groceries, not just rice and beans. He bought chicken, milk, eggs, and a small box of the colored crayons Lily loved. For the first time in months, Daniel Harris slept for 6 straight hours. But the miracle did not end there. 2 days later, a large insulated box appeared on his doorstep. There was no knock, no delivery truck. He simply opened the door to take Lily to the bus, and it was there. Inside was a week's worth of pre-made meals, the kind advertised in magazines, with fresh vegetables and vacuum-sealed proteins. Lily, whose diet had consisted of peanut butter and pasta, clapped her hands in delight. "Is it the lady in the coat?" she asked, her voice muffled as she peered into the box. "Maybe," Daniel said, his voice tight as he scanned the street. The white sedan was nowhere to be seen. The camera on the corner pole was just a black dome, inert and lifeless against the gray sky. He told himself he was being ungrateful. This was a blessing. He should accept it. The gifts continued. A new pair of steel-toed work boots for him, sitting on the mat one morning. A warm, down-filled coat for Lily, replacing her threadbare jacket. And then, envelopes. Tucked into his mailbox, bypassing the postal service, would be plain white envelopes containing cash. Sometimes $50, sometimes $100. There were never any notes, no explanation. Lily, in her 7-year-old wisdom, decided it was a secret helper, a concept she'd picked up from a cartoon. "He's watching to make sure we're okay, Daddy," she said one night, coloring a picture of a winged, smiling figure leaving a box on their porch. Daniel, watching her, felt a cold knot form in his stomach. She was right about one thing. Someone was definitely watching. The feeling of being observed began to curdle the relief. The normalcy he'd bought with the $2,000 felt thin, fragile. He started to notice things he'd ignored before. The faint, static-like interference on his small television, even on clear nights. The way Mrs. Gable from 3B, who used to sneer at him, now offered a pinched, nervous smile and hurried inside whenever she saw him. He found himself constantly glancing at the camera on the corner. He became obsessed with it. He'd stand by his window in the dark, watching it, willing it to reveal itself. One night, it did. A tiny pinprick of red light glowed from its housing, a digital heartbeat in the dark. It was active. It was recording. The paranoia solidified into certainty a week later. He and Lily were at the table, eating one of the donated meals. Lily was complaining good-naturedly about her crayons. "Barnaby says he wants a glittery one, a purple glitter one, but we don't have any," she said, holding the bear up to her plate. Daniel had smiled, a genuine smile, and said, "Well, glitter is very expensive, baby. We'll have to see." It was a nothing moment, a quiet exchange between a father and daughter in their own kitchen. The next morning, a small art kit was on the doorstep. It contained paint, brushes, and a new box of 64 crayons. He opened it, his hands shaking, and found what he was looking for. Tucked in the second row was a crayon labeled Plum Perfection Glitter. He tore the apartment apart. He looked for wires, for transmitters, for anything that didn't belong. He was a practical man, a man who understood hydraulics and wiring diagrams. This was just another system to be deconstructed. He found it under the kitchen table. It wasn't even well hidden, as if they assumed he'd be too grateful or too stupid to look. Taped to the underside of the cheap laminate, held in place by a strip of black gaffer's tape, was a small, black rectangle. A wireless microphone. It was active. A tiny green light pulsed faintly. They had heard her. They had heard everything. Every private word, every sigh of relief, every whispered promise he'd made to his sleeping daughter. His gratitude evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp rage. He didn't remove it. He left it there, a quiet, listening Judas in his home. Now, the packages felt like violations. The food tasted like deceit. He began examining every box, every label, searching for a clue. The gifts were always packaged in plain brown cardboard, the shipping labels generic, with a return address listed only as a post office box in the next state. But on the bottom of the box that had contained his new work boots, he found it. Pressed into the cardboard, almost invisible, was a small, embossed logo. It was a stylized dove, its wings spread, cradling the letters AG. It meant nothing to him. He searched the name American Workshop Fund online at the public library, but the organization was a ghost. Its website was a single page with a mission statement and no contact information, no staff list. He found the answer 3 days later. He was at the laundromat, the one place he was sure he wasn't being listened to, sorting his and Lily's clothes. On the Cork community board, pinned between a flyer for a missing cat and a business card for a plumber, was a slick, colorful poster. It was an advertisement for a new television show. "Ordinary people, extraordinary grace," the tagline read. And at the bottom, the same logo from the box, the stylized dove, its wings spread. "American Grace," the title proclaimed in bold, shining letters. "Where good deeds become great television, coming this fall." Daniel stood there, the scent of bleach and dryer sheets filling his lungs, his damp clothes clutched in his hand. He stared at the poster, at the smiling, diverse faces looking up in gratitude. The kindness, the food, the money, the glitter crayons. It wasn't charity. It was a production. He and his daughter, in their most desperate private moments, were not being helped. They were being filmed. The laundromat poster was a key. It didn't just have a logo. It had a production company's name in fine print at the bottom, Dovetail Media. A quick search at the library terminal gave him an address, not in their neighborhood, but in a slick, impersonal business park 20 minutes away by bus. The next morning, after dropping Lily at the bus stop, telling her he had a promising job interview, he made the trip. The building was all glass and brushed steel, a monument to the kind of world that didn't see men like him. He had no plan. He just knew he couldn't go back to his apartment, back to that listening microphone, until he understood the nature of the violation. He stood across the street, watching employees in crisp, fashionable clothes walk in, laughing, holding expensive coffees. He was invisible to them, just another piece of urban scenery. He waited for 2 hours in the cold, his anger a solid, hot coal in his chest. And then, he saw her. Clara Moore. She was wearing the same navy coat, her hair pulled back just as severely. She was walking with a man in a blazer, holding a tablet, and she was talking animatedly, a completely different person from the subdued, rehearsed case liaison who had stood on his porch. Daniel's breath hitched. He crossed the street, not running, but walking with a predatory, focused pace that made other pedestrians move aside. "Clara!" he called out. His voice was louder than he intended, sharp and raw. She stopped, her head whipping around. The professional smile on her face didn't just fade, it shattered. Her eyes widened, first in confusion, then in pure, unadulterated panic. The man with her looked at Daniel with annoyance. "Clara, do you know this person? This—" "Mr. Harris," she stammered, her composure gone. What are you doing here?" Her hand instinctively went to the briefcase she was carrying. "I think you know," Daniel said, his voice low and shaking, not with weakness, but with rage. He was close enough now that she could see the fury in his eyes. "American Grace, that's what you call it?" He spat the words. The man with her stepped slightly in front of her. "Sir, this is a private building. If you have a grievance, you can file it." Daniel ignored him, his eyes locked on Clara. "You put a microphone in my house. You filmed my daughter. You filmed me when I thought I was at my lowest. Was it entertaining? Did you get what you needed?" "Clara, what is he talking about?" the man demanded. "Go inside, Mark. I'll handle this," she said, her voice a strained whisper. "Handle it? He's accusing us of—" "Go! Inside! Now!" The man, clearly outranked or intimidated, gave Daniel one last look of disgust and hurried into the building. The glass doors hissed shut, leaving Daniel and Clara alone on the wide, empty plaza. "You have to understand," she began, her eyes darting around, checking for other employees. I'm an assistant producer. I do what I'm told." The admission hit him like a physical blow. Case liaison was a lie. American Workshop Fund was a lie. The entire premise of his rescue was a fiction. "You lied to me," he said, the words flat. You came to my home, you saw my child, and you lied. It's not all a lie, she said desperately, taking a step back. The show is real. We find people who are genuinely struggling, people the system has failed. We give them a second chance. The money was real, Mr. Harris. The food was real. He laughed, a short, bitter sound. And the cameras, the microphone under my table, are those real too? You didn't find me, did you? You set me up. You waited until I was desperate, until I hadn't eaten, and then you knocked on the door. You built a stage, and I was the main act. He was piecing it together, the eviction notice, the empty fridge. They hadn't just observed his suffering, they had curated it, waiting for the perfect moment to make their entrance, all for the sake of a good story. The noble father sacrificing for his daughter, right? That's the angle? Clara's face crumpled. The guilt that he had suspected was now plain, washing over her features. It's worse than you think, she whispered, pulling him slightly to the side, away from the main entrance. It's not just about helping you. It's about viewer engagement. The producers, they're editing your story right now. They've been following you for weeks, long before I knocked. She confirmed his darkest fears. They had footage of him at the day labor line, being turned away. They had footage of him at the plasma center, looking pale and defeated. They had audio from the microphone of him comforting Lily, promising her things would get better, all while his stomach audibly growled. They're cutting it all together, she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and self-loathing. They're building this narrative of a fallen saint, a man who would starve himself to death for his child. The episode is called A Father's Hunger. The title was obscene. It took his most profound, private shame and turned it into a tagline. You have to help me, Clara said, her professionalism completely gone, replaced by the raw urgency of someone trying to undo a terrible mistake. They're going to air it. They're going to turn your life into a tearjerker for ratings. I can't let it happen. Not to you and Lily. She fumbled with the clasp on her briefcase, her hands shaking. I've been copying the raw files. All of it. The unedited footage from the street camera, the hidden cameras, and the audio from the microphone in your kitchen. She pulled out a small black USB drive, its plastic casing looking ridiculously small for the weight of the information it held. It's all on here, she said, pressing it into his hand. It's the proof. It's not just the footage of you, it's the audio of them. The producers, Mark, discussing how to sweeten your story, how to maximize the sacrifice angle. They're monsters, Daniel. He looked at the small object in his palm. It was a bomb. It was the truth. He could take this, go to a newspaper, go to a lawyer. He could expose them for the parasites they were. But as he looked at the drive, a different, colder fear eclipsed his anger. He saw his apartment. He saw the humming refrigerator, full of food. He saw the eviction notice, now paid. He saw Lily's new coat. If he did this, if he declared war on a media company, what would happen? They would fight back. They would drag his name through the mud. They would paint him as an ungrateful con artist who took their money and then tried to extort them. And worse, they would call child services. They would use their own footage of his empty kitchen, of his desperation, as evidence that he was an unfit father. They would take Lily. The thought was paralyzing. He had just gotten his daughter back from the brink, and now this woman was asking him to risk her all for the sake of his honor. He closed his hand around the drive, his knuckles white. Then, slowly, he pushed her hand and the drive away. No, he said, his voice hollow. I can't. Clara stared at him, her face ashen. What? But they're destroying you. They're profiting from your pain. And I am living, Daniel shot back, his voice cracking. My daughter is eating. My rent is paid. Do you think I care about my story? I care about her. If I fight you, I lose. Men like me always lose against men like you. They will take her from me. I know they will. He took a step back, the fight draining out of him, leaving only a vast, bone-deep weariness. Just stop it. Stop the filming. Don't air the show. That's all I want. Leave me and my daughter alone. We never asked for your grace. He turned his back on her, on the truth she was offering, and began the long walk back to the bus stop, leaving a stunned Clara Moore standing alone on the plaza. The USB drive still clutched in her outstretched hand. Daniel's refusal felt like a small, hollow victory. He walked away from Clara, his back straight, the USB drive a phantom weight in the hand he'd refused to open. He returned to the apartment, to the humming refrigerator and the prepaid rent, and told himself he had made the right choice. He had chosen his daughter. He had chosen survival. The alternative, a war against a faceless media company, a war that would use his poverty and his love as weapons against him, was a luxury he could not afford. For 3 days, a tense, artificial peace settled over the small home. He took Lily to the park. He cooked real, balanced meals. He left the microphone under the table, a silent, dead sentinel. He had drawn his line. Leave us alone. He convinced himself they had listened. The junk illusion was shattered not by a television screen. He didn't have cable, only a small digital antenna that pulled in 3 local channels, but by the eyes of his community. He went to the corner bodega to buy milk. Mr. Patel, the owner, who had once offered him bruised fruit for free, now stared at him from behind the register. There was no warmth in his eyes, only a cool, appraising pity. "Saw you on TV last night, Harris," Patel said, his voice flat as he bagged the milk. "American Grace. Real, touching story." The way he said touching made it sound like dirty. Daniel felt a cold prickle on his neck. "I don't know what you're talking about," he mumbled, handing over the cash. "Sure you don't," Patel said, turning away. "Must be nice. Having Grace pay the bills." A sick, sinking dread propelled him to the public library. He sat at a terminal, his hands shaking so badly he could barely type the name of the show. He found the network's website. The episode was right there on the front page, the lead story. A Father's Hunger, the Noble Sacrifice. He clicked it. His own face stared back at him. The episode was a 20-minute masterpiece of emotional manipulation. But the saint narrative he and Clara had discussed was gone. This was something far more insidious. The edit was brutal. They showed him standing in the day labor line, but cut the scene just as his bad arm buckled, making it look like he'd simply given up and walked away. They had audio of him telling Lily he'd find a way, but they overlaid it with a saccharine, weeping violin, stripping it of all dignity. The worst was the footage from the corner store, taken a month ago, before Clara, before everything. They showed him counting change, his face tight with stress. Then they cut to footage. After he'd gotten the check, using a hidden camera inside the grocery store. They showed him buying the crayons, and then he'd picked up a small, $5 plastic doll for Lily, an impulse of a father desperate to give his child one normal, happy thing. The voiceover, a deep, empathetic baritone, did the knife work. "For some, the line between need and want is blurred," the voice said gravely. Even with his rent paid and his fridge full, Daniel's first thought was not saving for the next storm, but spending on the comforts of the moment. They had turned him from a desperate father into a short-sighted, irresponsible fool. They had twisted his sacrifice into a character flaw. He was not a hero. He was a pity case, a professional victim. The backlash was immediate. His world, which had just started to stabilize, collapsed overnight. He went to a follow-up interview for a stocking job at a local supermarket, a job he had been almost certain he would get. The manager, who had been enthusiastic last week, now wouldn't meet his eye. "Look, Mr. Harris," the man said, shuffling papers. "We appreciate you coming in, but we've decided to go in a different direction. We're just not sure you're the right fit for our company culture right now." The rejection was polite, but the message was a thunderclap. He was radioactive. He walked home. Mrs. Gable from 3B was on her porch. She saw him and pointedly turned her back, muttering just loud enough for him to hear, "Some of us have to work for a living." His first feeling was confusion, then shame, then a white-hot, blinding rage directed at only one person. Clara. She had played him. She must have known. The USB drive, the confession, it was all part of the show. It was a loyalty test, a second act. Will the desperate man bite the hand that feeds him? She had been watching for his reaction. He had refused the drive, and in their twisted narrative, that must have confirmed his passivity, his willingness to accept the handout. He was a fool. He had trusted her, even for a second, and she had used his decency against him. He slammed his apartment door, the sound rattling the frame. He was trapped. He was more a prisoner now, with a full refrigerator and the scorn of his neighbors, than he had been when he was starving. That night there was a knock. It wasn't the measured, rehearsed knock of Clara Moore, case liaison. It was a frantic, desperate pounding that sounded like knuckles on the verge of splitting. He ripped the door open, ready to unleash his fury. It was Clara, but it was not the woman he knew. Her hair was stringy, plastered to her face by a cold rain. Her expensive coat was gone, replaced by a simple, soaked hoodie. Her eyes were red and wild. "They aired it," she hissed, pushing past him into the kitchen, dripping water onto the linoleum. "I tried to stop it, Daniel. I swear to God, I tried." He just stared at her, his rage momentarily frozen by her genuine panic. "What are you talking about? You did this!" "No," she almost screamed, whirling on him. "I didn't. When you refused the drive, I tried to leak it. I went to an internal compliance officer, someone I thought I could trust. I was wrong." Her story came out in a torrent. "Mark, my boss, he was waiting at my desk when I got back. Security was with him. They had been watching me. They knew I had copied the files. They fired me on the spot." She was breathless, pacing his small kitchen like a caged animal. "They made me sign an NDA. They threatened to sue me into oblivion, to blacklist me. They said they were accelerating the broadcast schedule for your episode to control the narrative before I could get the footage out. They destroyed me to protect the show. And they destroyed you." The red herring of her betrayal dissolved, replaced by a much uglier truth. They were both victims. "I thought you were one of them," he said, his voice flat, hollow. "I know," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "That's what they count on." She fumbled in the pocket of her wet jeans. "They confiscated my laptop, my work phone, the drive I offered you. It was a decoy. I'd planned for it, just in case. But they didn't search me. They didn't get this one." She pulled out a different USB drive, a tiny silver one, the master copy. "I lost my job, Daniel. I lost my apartment. I can't pay my own rent. They've already called every contact I have and painted me as unstable and disgruntled. They took my whole career." She shoved the drive into his hand. It was cold and wet from the rain. "They took everything from me, and they took your name from you. They're making money, right now, off a lie they told about you." He stood there, holding the drive. The bomb was back in his hands. But everything was different. His safety was an illusion. His silence had bought him nothing but contempt. The community he lived in now believed he was a cheat. His job prospects were gone. They had already done their worst. The choice was no longer safety versus honor. The choice was a slow, public death by shame, or one desperate, righteous fight for the truth. He looked toward Lily's bedroom. She was sleeping, unaware that her father was the most famous fraud in the neighborhood. His hand, which had been shaking with rage, was now perfectly steady. He closed his fist around the drive. He looked at Clara. Her panic had subsided, leaving an exhausted, defiant resolve. "What do we do?" he asked. The apartment was suffocatingly quiet. The only sound the metallic tick-tick-tick of rain against the window pane. Clara stood dripping on the linoleum, her face pale. The silver USB drive held between them like a detonator. The illusion of his safety was gone, burned away by the public scorn he'd endured all day. The choice was no longer abstract. It was here, cold and hard and small in his hand. He took the drive from her. He looked past her, toward Lily's closed door, where his daughter slept, oblivious to the fact that her father had become a public caricature of a mooch. He had been silent to protect her. Now, he had to fight to protect her. "You have a computer?" he asked, his voice a low growl. "They took it," Clara said. "We can't use this apartment. The microphone." "I know," Daniel said. He ripped the small black rectangle from beneath the table, the gaffer's tape tearing a strip of laminate with it. He snapped the device in his fist and threw it into the trash. "It doesn't matter. They've already shown their hand. We go public, not at the library. We go somewhere they can't trace." They drove for 30 minutes in Clara's rain-battered hatchback, the one asset the producers hadn't known to seize. They ended up at a 24-hour copy shop in a different county, a bleak, fluorescent-lit place that smelled of ozone and stale coffee. Clara, her producer's mind now weaponized against its creators, took charge. She didn't go to a random blog. She knew exactly who to send it to. "The Mediaverse," she whispered, her fingers flying across the public terminal's keyboard. "It's an industry watchdog. They're independent, and they despise Dovetail Media. They'll verify it, and they'll post it." She plugged in the drive. A file structure appeared. It wasn't just raw footage. It was organized. Folders labeled Audio Kitchen Mic, Camera at A Street, Camera B Bodega, and one simply, damnably, labeled The Pitch. Clara clicked the pitch. It was an audio file. Mark's voice, the man in the blazer, filled the quiet copy shop, tinny and arrogant. "The angle is a father's hunger," Mark was saying to a room of executives. "We wait. We let the fridge empty. We let him skip his third, maybe his fourth meal. We need the desperation to be visible. When Clara knocks on that door, we need him to look like a man on the absolute edge. That's the moment of grace. That's the money shot." Daniel listened, his stomach clenching until it ached. They hadn't just observed his suffering. They had authored it, directed it. Clara attached the file. She attached the raw video from the street, showing the cameraman in a parked van, laughing. She attached the unedited footage of Daniel at the grocery store, showing him agonizing over the $5 doll for 10 minutes, before finally, guiltily, putting it in his basket. She wrote a short anonymous email. "The enclosed files are the unedited source material for American Grace, episode 104, A Father's Hunger. The truth is in the metadata. Compare it to the broadcast. You are being lied to." She hit send. They walked out into the rain. The act done. The fuse was lit. It didn't take 24 hours. It took 6. By dawn, The Mediaverse had posted a scathing, meticulous breakdown. The headline was simple and brutal. The footage American Grace didn't want you to see. Producers caught authoring desperation of starving father. The post went viral. The audio file of Mark detailing the hunger pitch was the smoking gun. The story was picked up not just by blogs, but by rival news organizations who smelled blood in the water. By noon, the hashtag #CancelAmericanGrace was the #1 trend in the country. By 3 o'clock, two of the show's largest sponsors, a family-friendly automaker and a national soda brand, had released statements pulling all advertising, effective immediately. By 5, Dovetail Media's stock had cratered, and the network had announced it was suspending the program pending a full internal investigation. The wave of justice was not a gentle tide. It was a tsunami, and it had capsized them. Daniel was no longer a local pariah. He was a cause célèbre. His phone, which had been silent for months, rang. It was not a bill collector. It was a producer from WNNN, a major national news network. They wanted to fly him and Clara to New York. They wanted him for a live, prime-time interview. He stood in his kitchen, the humming refrigerator a background noise to his pounding heart. "Yes," he said. "Yes, we'll be there." 2 days later, he was sitting in a makeup chair in a studio so bright it made his eyes water. He felt like an astronaut, completely disconnected from his own life. He was wearing a dark, borrowed suit that was too tight in the shoulders. A makeup artist was trying to put powder on his face, but he gently waved her away. "I just want to be myself," he said. He wasn't an actor, not anymore. Clara, who was also scheduled to speak, squeezed his shoulder before they went on. "You don't have to do anything but tell the truth," she said, her own eyes wide with a mixture of terror and vindication. "The truth is all we have." He nodded, his throat dry. He was clutching something in his hand. As the floor manager called his name, he walked onto the set and sat down opposite the host, a famous newswoman known for her sharp, incisive questions. As he sat, he placed the object from his hand on the polished black desk between them. Barnaby, the one-eyed, threadbare teddy bear. The host raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. The floor manager counted down. A red light on a camera lit up. They were live. "Mr. Harris," the host began, her voice empathetic but firm. "The nation has now heard the audio. It is frankly unconscionable. But the producers at Dovetail Media, who have all been fired, I should add, released a statement claiming you were a willing participant. They say you knew what you were doing. You took the $2,000. You took the food. You played the part. What do you say to that?" This was the moment. All the cameras in the room were focused on him. He could feel the heat of the lights. He was not angry. He was not emotional. He was just tired. And he was done lying. And he was done being lied to. He looked at the host, but he spoke to the millions of people watching. "Yes, ma'am, I took the money," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying in the silent studio. "They came to my home at dawn. I hadn't eaten in 2 days. My daughter, my 7-year-old daughter. Her lunchbox was empty for the next day's school." He paused, not for dramatic effect, but to control the thickness in his throat. "You are right. I took the money. I would have taken it from anyone. I would have done anything in that moment to hear my refrigerator turn on. They didn't capture a story of a grateful man. They exploited a cornered animal. They mistook my desperation for a lack of character." The host was silent, allowing him to speak. He gestured to the footage playing on a monitor behind her. "What you saw on that show, that wasn't me. That was a character they wrote. They called me irresponsible for buying my daughter a $5 doll. They didn't show the footage of me standing in that aisle for 10 minutes, crying, because I just wanted her to feel normal for one afternoon. They didn't show the audio of me telling her a bedtime story about a magical father who could fix anything, all while my own stomach was cramping. He unconsciously reached out and put one finger on the head of the small bear. The camera, the real camera, zoomed in slightly, capturing the gesture. "And this," he said, tapping the bear. "This is Barnaby. He belongs to my daughter, Lily. She told me to bring him so I wouldn't be lonely on the airplane. She doesn't know about any of this. She just knows her daddy had to go to work." He finally looked directly into the lens, at the small red light that meant the world was watching. "I didn't want to be a hero. I didn't want to be a story. And I am not looking for your pity." His voice was steady, strong, and true. "I just wanted to be a father. Properly. I just want to work a decent job and pay my rent on time and pack my daughter's lunch. That is all. That is all this was ever about." The studio was absolutely silent. The host stared at him, her professional composure visibly cracking. She nodded slowly. "Mr. Harris," she said, her voice soft. "Thank you. Thank you for your honesty." The red light on the camera clicked off. He had been filmed, but for the first time it was the truth. The light was the first thing he noticed. He stood by the window, the same window where he had once watched the street shimmer with a cold, desperate light. This morning, the light was different. It was yellow, not gray. It was warm, not sharp. It spilled across the old linoleum floor, illuminating the scuffs and cracks, not as evidence of poverty, but just as geography, the map of a life being lived. The street outside was waking up. He heard a sanitation truck in the distance, the slam of a car door, the call of a neighbor. These were just the sounds of a Tuesday, no longer the sounds of a world moving on without him. The ache in his stomach was gone, replaced by the lingering, pleasant weight of the coffee he'd just finished. He was not a man waiting for a miracle, nor was he a man bracing for a blow. He was just a man, standing in his own kitchen, in the morning sun. Behind him, he heard the cheerful scrape of a fork against a ceramic plate. Lily was at the table, her feet swinging in time to a song she was humming, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail he had helped her tie. In front of her was a plate with the last of the pancakes they had made together. The refrigerator, his old, silent adversary, now provided a steady, supportive hum from the corner, full of milk, eggs, and juice. His new life had begun 2 weeks ago, the day after the interview. The call hadn't come from a television studio, but from a local number he didn't recognize. "Is this Daniel Harris?" a gruff voice had asked. "My name is Arthur Henderson. I own the hardware store over on Maple Street. Saw you on the television. You strike me as a man who knows the difference between a bolt and a screw. And you strike me as a man who doesn't lie." Daniel had started the following Monday. His job was simple, and in its simplicity, it was a balm. He unloaded trucks, stocked shelves, mixed paint, and talked to customers about their leaky faucets and garden projects. He worked with his hands, his good arm and his bad, and when he came home at night, he was tired. It was a good, clean exhaustion, the kind that came from labor, not from fear. Mr. Henderson paid him a fair wage, in a check, every Friday, with his name on it. It wasn't a fortune. It wouldn't buy him a new car or a house in the suburbs. But it paid the rent. It paid the electric bill. It filled the cabinets, and for the first time in a year, it allowed him to breathe. He was free, not from poverty, but from the suffocating, daily terror of it. "Daddy, you're staring at the window," Lily said, her voice muffled by a mouthful of pancake. "Are you watching for the mailman?" He smiled and turned, sitting down across from her. The small kitchen, which had once felt like a prison, now just felt like home. "No, baby, just thinking." Lily considered this with the profound seriousness of a 7-year-old. She looked down at her plate, where one large golden-brown pancake remained. Then, using her fork with surgical precision, she cut it exactly in half. She pushed her plate toward the center of the table and then used her fork to slide the larger of the two halves onto his empty one. "You think too much," she announced, her voice full of authority. "You need to eat more." He looked at the piece of pancake. It was warm, steaming slightly, covered in a spiderweb of syrup. He thought of that other night, the sound of her soft, guilty chewing, the half sandwich she'd tried to share. That had been an offering born of scarcity. This was an offering born of abundance. She wasn't giving him her only food. She was sharing her extra food. The distinction was a universe. His throat tightened, but not with hunger. It was a feeling so potent, so full, it was almost pain. It was gratitude. He picked up his own fork, speared the piece of pancake, and ate it. It was the best thing he had ever tasted. "You're right," he said, his voice thick. "It's very good." He had received a postcard last week. It was a stark, beautiful picture of a red rock canyon against a deep blue sky. He had flipped it over, recognizing the sharp, intelligent handwriting immediately. It was from Clara. She had taken the settlement that Dovetail Media had offered, a large, six-figure sum, to ensure her silence and avoid a wrongful termination lawsuit. But she hadn't stayed in that world. "Daniel," the card read, "I'm in Arizona. I'm starting a new foundation, a real one. No cameras, no producers, no story, just helping people get their power turned back on. I'm calling it the Workshop Fund, just to spite them. Thank you for reminding me what the truth feels like. Be well." See, he was happy for her. She had found her own catharsis. Not all kindness was clean, but she had found a way to scrub it, to make it new. His life, he knew, would not be a movie. There was no grand reward, no $1,000,000 check from a grateful billionaire. His reward was this. It was the smell of coffee. It was the steady hum of an appliance. It was the uncomplicated love of his daughter, who no longer had to eat as if she were stealing. He had learned that poverty was not a source of shame. He had never been ashamed of being poor. He had only been ashamed of his desperation. The show had tried to capitalize on that, to confuse his desperate circumstances with a flawed character. But he had stood in the glare of their lights and refused to be that character. He had refused to be ashamed. He had simply been a father. He finished his coffee and rinsed the mug in the sink. He looked at the clock. 7:30. It was time to walk Lily to the bus stop, and then it was time for him to go to work. He grabbed his jacket, the one that wasn't new, but was warm enough. He held the door for his daughter, who ran past him, Barnaby clutched in her hand. He stepped out onto the landing. He paused, his hand on the doorknob, and looked back into the empty kitchen, at the plates on the table and the morning light on the floor. He hadn't been rescued by a miracle. He had been rescued by the truth. He pulled the door shut, the lock clicking firmly into place, and walked his daughter down the stairs into the business of the day.